call ourselves the Haudenosaunee, or the Haudenosaunee, meaning the people who are building a longhouse, the people that completed a house. That longhouse really is a symbol of the actual building that we used to live in, but it's also a metaphor for our way of life. And it also is a symbol of how we govern ourselves. 5 nations, 5 extended families living under one roof. That roof is the common law. We call it Great Law.
So the Longhouse then became kind of the touchstone for all the Iroquois. This was the basic unit of their society. And so it was natural for them to seize upon that as the metaphor for the League of the Iroquois. So they imagined then that there was a great invisible longhouse that stretched across New York State from near what is now Albany to near what is now Rochester through the Finger Lakes area, with the ends of the longhouse being occupied conceptually by the Mohawks at the east end, the Senecas at the west, the Onondagas at the middle, and the other 2 nations of the League of the Iroquois, the Oneida and the Cayuga, being between them. So it's an interesting metaphor that they came up with that was based in their domestic architecture.
We start off with this lodge where the families are together, and slowly as the families grow, as other nations join us, the longhouse keeps extending. And ideally it extends from where the sun rises in the east to where it sets in the west. So it really is the symbol that through peace we will become united and strong.
One translation from the French explorer Samuel de Champlain in 1616 describes an Iroquois longhouse.
Their cabins are in the shape of tunnels or arbors and are covered with the bark of trees. They are from 25 to 30 fathoms long and 6 fathoms wide, having a passageway through the middle from 10 to 12 feet wide. On the sides, there's a kind of bench 4 feet high, where they sleep in the summer in order to prevent the annoyance of fleas, of which there are great numbers. In the winter, they sleep on the ground on mats near the fire, so as to be warmer than they would be on the platform. They have pieces of wood suspended on which they put their clothes, provisions, and other things for fear of mice. In one of these houses there may be 12 fires and 24 families. It smokes excessively, from which it follows that many receive serious injury to the eyes, so that they lose their vision toward the close of their life. There is no window, nor any other opening except in the upper part of their cabins for the smoke to escape.
It would typically be a house that would have a series of compartments, and somewhere in that house there would be a senior female and her husband. And the other compartments were occupied by that woman's daughters, maybe her sisters, maybe her granddaughters, and the various men that had married into the family, who had moved to this longhouse from other longhouses.
You know, one thing about Haudenosaunee Village is everybody had a role to play, and very important roles. There was a balanced society. The men had work to do, the women had important work to do. In fact, the women were probably more involved in orchestrating the economy of the village, because they're out doing the planting and the crops, producing the clothes and producing the kitchenware and all of the utensils. The men are out in the woods gathering raw material, hunting, fishing, trapping. Best way to look at it is the domain of the men is out in the woods. The domain of the women is within the clearing where the village and the fields are. Now the old people, or we would call elders, they also are the mentors for the young kids. They're there to teach them the finer details about things. But what we believe is that everybody's born with a certain gift. You have one, I have one, everybody has one. As soon as that gift becomes revealed, then you have to master that gift for the sake of the community. It's like you learn how to make a pot. But you're also hearing the stories about clay, how the first pot was made and what the designs mean. So as you're making these things, you're learning about the larger history. And that's where the old people would come in and tell you that history.
Iroquois women presided over all of the cultivation, along with help from the youngsters.
The method of growing the crops involved girdling the trees and letting the sun come into the forest during the heat of the summer. But the planting was a fairly easy task of simply using simple hoes to scrape up the soil of the forest, which is pretty loose. Forest stuff is easy to work with. Scrape that up into hills, and those small hills were then planted with sometimes all three, but sometimes just one or two of their main crops. So certainly they'd put some corn kernels in the hill. They might put in some beans, and they might put in some squash. Now these three plants work together in a beautiful sort of way, not just nutritionally later on after they were harvested, but also while they were growing. The beans could use the corn stalks like bean poles. So the corn stalks provide support for not just the corn itself, but also for the beans that are twining up the corn stalk. At the same time, the squash spread out on the ground between the hills and shaded the ground and suppressed other weeds that otherwise would have competed with the plants. So they've got all three of these things growing together.
Around the age of 10, the boys would begin traveling with their fathers instead of staying to help closer to the village with their mothers. These young men were extremely excited to be able to go on long hunting and fishing expeditions that might last for many days at a time.
The old Longhouse lifestyle was very hard. You had to do a lot of work, but at the same time we had a lot of ways for the people to entertain themselves. One of them was lacrosse. Now we believe lacrosse started right at the time of creation. The two creator twins that were wrestling for who's going to have domain over this land played lacrosse, and they played to a draw. So when we play lacrosse today, it's like we are reenacting that kind of great celestial battle for the domain. And we also believe that our ancestors pass and go back up to the sky world, that they play lacrosse up there. It's the Creator's favorite game. He just loves to see us play. And it was a way for the men to, kind of exercise themselves, relieve a lot of stress, and promote a friendly rivalry, we'll say.
They spent a lot of time engaged in ritual activity that was designed to reinforce the community. So you've got the Strawberry Festival. In the spring you've got the Thunderers, which is to welcome the thunderstorms of the spring. The green corn ceremony in, say, August, and then the harvest ceremony in the fall. And over again, what happens in these cyclical kinds of ceremonies is that there's a great deal of attention paid to the Thanksgiving address. The whole purpose of the Thanksgiving address is to recognize the indebtedness of human beings to the resources that are provided by nature.
The Iroquois were very thankful for what the Creator had given them. They were also incredibly resourceful, finding uses for the hide, such as clothing and bedding, as well as endless uses for bones and antlers.
They were smart about how they went out into the environment. They dressed warmly as they could. They would stuff their moccasins with moss in order to give them some insulation. They wore leggings, and they wore long cape-like cloaks of beaver pelts stitched together. Those are pretty warm. But nonetheless, if you're going to avoid frostbite, if you don't want to lose fingers in the bitter cold of the depth of winter, then you just stay inside until it blows over. Now that can be pretty rough if you have an extended period of snowfall and cold weather. You might find yourself starving, and the choice then is to either go out, try to find a deer, or to stay inside and starve to death. So it's a hard choice, and mortality was pretty high under Aboriginal conditions for folks in this environment. In the middle of the winter was a time when they would be making a lot of their tools, getting ready for the summer, carving things. A lot of artistic expression is the consequence of having time on your hands.
The men would come back to the village, and that's the time where stories are told. winter. And primarily because they said if you tell the stories in the spring and the summer, they're such great stories that all the animals get kind of lazy and they gather around and listen to these stories and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. First of all, you know how drab the winters are here. You need these animated stories to enliven your spirit. So that's the time when you learn about what's going to happen. So it would be great storytelling time. The storyteller would come by and usually they would carry this little bag full of goodies, you know, and they'd reach in the bag and pull out something, maybe pull out a bear tooth. He says, oh, this tooth reminds me of this great monster bear. I'm going to tell you about them. And the storyteller is kind of an animator. He brings that story alive. And so that was the way in which our people taught each other. The other thing, too, is you can imagine then our world, or our comprehension of the world, was gained through these stories. That's how we learned who we are and where we belong. Today, television has invaded our homes, and our kids are hearing everybody else's stories but ours. So it's no wonder that we're a little confused these days.
Man cannot discover new oceans unless he has the courage to lose sight of the shore. Marie-Louise von Franz, a Swiss psychologist, noticed a disturbing trend in the mid-20th century. Many men and women who were well into their adult years remained psychologically stunted in their maturation. They occupied the bodies of adults, but their mental development failed to keep pace. Von Franz saw this as such a pressing issue that in 1959 she gave a series of lectures on the psychology of the puer aeternus, which is Latin for eternal child. While originally this term was used in mythology to refer to a child god who remains forever young, her teacher Carl Jung had adopted the term for psychological purposes to describe the individual who, like Peter Pan, fails to grow up. In one of her lectures, von Franz describes the puer aeternus as the individual who remains too long in adolescent psychology, that is, all those characteristics that are normal in a youth of 17 or 18 are continued into later life, coupled in most cases with too great a dependence on the mother. Von Franz predicted that in the coming decades what she called the problem of the puer aeternus would spread across the world and affect more and more individuals. Her predictions have proven remarkably accurate, especially among the male population of the Western world. Many young men are struggling academically, socially, spiritually, financially, and sexually. They are living at home into their late 20s and 30s, choosing to remain in the comforting confines of their parents' care rather than testing the unknown waters of independence. Instead of striving to create something of themselves, many prefer the familiar and comfortable virtual worlds of internet, pornography, and video games. They are passive wanderers in life with no path or purpose, save the pursuit of momentary pleasure to ease their suffering. Based on the scope of this problem, it would not be far-fetched to claim that the problem of the puer aeternus is the primary neurosis of the modern age. The purpose of this course is to provide an antidote to those who suffer from this problem. To do this, we are going to provide an in-depth psychological analysis of the puer aeternus, and building on insights from Carl Jung, Soren Kierkegaard, von Franz, and others, provide practical advice on how to commence on a more responsible, enriching, successful, and independent life path. Before we examine the psychology of the puer aeternus, it is necessary to take note of the conditions which have given rise to this social problem. And toward this end, we must discuss how a strong mother complex stunts the maturation of many today. For as von Franz notes, a man who has a mother complex will always have to contend with his tendencies toward becoming a puer aeternus. Throughout our evolutionary history, the mother and father have assumed different parental roles. Mothers have always interacted with their children more than fathers. They maintain more physical contact and are more nurturing, comforting, and empathetic to the physical and emotional pains and needs of the child. This extremely intimate and close relationship with the mother figure creates in the child a lasting emotional mark, or a highly resistant psychological bond psychologists call a mother complex. The child's experience of the mother, writes James Hollis, is internalized as a complex, an emotionally charged cluster of energy beyond the control of the ego. Fathers do not create this same bond of dependency with the child. Instead, their role has traditionally been to provide the developing child with resources and protection, but just as importantly with guidance. More specifically, the role of the father has been to help the child break free from their bond of dependency with the mother, and so help him emerge into the world as an independent and functional adult. In most cultures throughout history, individuals transitioned from adolescence to adulthood with the help of initiatory rites of passage. The primary goal of all initiatory rites of passage, cross-culturally, was to separate the youth from his mother, first physically and then psychologically. These rites were performed shortly after the onset of puberty and were instituted solely by the elder males of the tribe, the cultural fathers. Women were generally banned from observing or participating in these rituals. A typical rite of passage, as explained by Mircea Eliade in his book Rites and Symbols of Initiation, proceeded as follows. In the middle of the night, the cultural fathers of the tribe, dressed as gods or demons, would snatch the youth from his bed. This was the last time the youth would see his mother, sometimes for months. The youth would be taken to a deep cave, buried alive, or else plunged into some other sort of literal or symbolic darkness. This stage represented the symbolic death of the youth's childhood, the loss of paradise and the joys of irresponsibility. It was meant to convey to the youth the message, you can't go home again. Following the symbolic death of childhood, a ceremony of rebirth would be performed, marking the young adult's transformation to a more mature state of being. He was subsequently taught by the elders the wisdom and knowledge of the tribe, and then sent off into the wilderness, where he would spend many months alone struggling for his survival. Upon his successful return, he was welcomed back into the tribe as an adult member. The youth, from that point on, was expected to have overcome his mother complex. Immaturity and dependency were no longer acceptable. Given the intensity and sometimes violent nature of these initiation processes, it appears as if our ancestors understood that separating a young boy from his mother was a monumental task requiring deliberate measures. In the West today, there is no equivalent for these rites of passage. It has often been said, notes Mircea Eliade, that one of the characteristics of the modern world is the disappearance of any meaningful rites of initiation. Lacking cultural fathers and rites of initiation, the youth today must turn to their personal father to provide them with initiation into adulthood. But unfortunately, not all fathers can supply their children with this guidance. For to do so, the father must be strong and independent himself and emotionally present in the child's life. He must be able to show, by example, that there is something worth seeking and struggling for in this world. For to successfully encourage a young man to break from the comforts of childhood, he needs to be convinced there is somewhere worth going. Sons also need to watch their father in the world, writes James Hollis. They need him to show them how to be in the world, how to work, how to bounce back from adversity. They need the activation of their inherent masculinity, both by outer modeling and by direct affirmation. In his book Finding Our Fathers, Sam Ocheron cites an expansive study in which only 17% of American men reported having a positive relationship with their father during their youth. In most cases, the father was physically or emotionally absent. Reflecting on this statistic, the psychotherapist James Hollis writes, "If this amazing statistic is even close to the truth, something large and tragic has happened to one of the critical balances of nature. A disruption in the critical balance of human nature is exactly what has happened. We live in the epoch of the absent father, and many suffer greatly as a result. Young men are expected to leave the comforts of home, to overcome their mother complex, and to sculpt a life worth living, all without the psychological support of a father. Is it any wonder that the problem of the puer aeternus is so prominent in our time? But the effects of an absent father are worsened by the impact this situation has on the mother. For it produces a situation where, firstly, the mother tends to become more authoritative in her parenting to compensate for the lack of a masculine figure in the child's life. And secondly, a failure on the part of the father to provide the mother with love and support creates in her an emotional hunger, which she attempts to satiate through her relationship with her child. This situation creates the perfect storm, whereby the mother becomes what Jungians call a devouring mother. She overprotects and smothers her child and becomes involved in every aspect of his life. It is often the case that such a mother, despite having the best intentions, unconsciously manipulates her child into remaining dependent on her well into adulthood, and it is often the case that the child willingly complies. Behold the secret conspiracy between mother and son, writes Jung, and how each helps the other to betray life. A child brought up in this manner, and thus never granted the opportunity to venture out on his own, to stand up for himself, to fail and fix his own mistakes, or to make decisions for himself, will develop into an adult crippled in his capacity to endure and overcome the inevitable challenges and struggles of life. The healthy desire to adapt himself to reality and to individuate, both of which entail fear, pain, and conflict, will be replaced by his need to remain bounded to his mother, whether it be his personal mother or a symbolic substitute in the world. If he does not remain dependent on his biological mother, He may desperately seek to find in other women a nurturing replacement, or else lose himself in the comforting embrace of an addiction. In other words, when a child emerges into adulthood with a strong mother complex, he will not seek to develop his independence and evolve his consciousness, but rather will be possessed by what Jung called the spirit of regression, which threatens us with bondage to the mother and with dissolution and extinction in the unconscious. He will find himself in the service of sleep, and not the battle of life. He hopes to be caught, sucked in, enveloped, and devoured, writes Jung. He seeks, as it were, the protecting, nourishing, charmed circle of the mother, the condition of the infant released from every care. No wonder that the real world vanishes from sight.